Okay, I'm sitting here with bentahuntly. She's a member of Muscogee First Nation, and she's going to share her history and her family history with us. Welcome, Benta.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself, please.
Okay. Hi. My name is Bentahuntly. I'm from Muscogee First Nations. My mother was born and raised here. We're a member of the Bear family. My dad was from Denmark. He was born and raised in Denmark, and my mom and dad actually met in Birch Hills. So it's kind of cool stories around there. And because he was non-indigenous from here, it was before Bill C-31, so my mom had to leave the reserve, and she lost her status. She had lost her status, and so we lived on a farm, and my dad worked on a farm not too far from here, around the East Central area, before I go into that, I'll just talk a little bit about my mother's mother. I never knew my dad's parents. They both died before he came over from Denmark. But my mom's parents were Granny Princess Maud Bear and Leonard Bear from Muscogee. And I've actually traced the family history back to Grandpa Henry, that's my Grandma Maud's dad, back to the Orkney Islands, back to 1600s, to Magnus Tate. So we have a long lineage there. And Grandpa Leonard's side, I didn't go very far back on his. I couldn't trace his too far back, but we've got history in the Red River as well area, and with Grandpa Henry's great Grandpa Henry's wife was Annabella Kennedy from the Red River area. I even have their marriage certificate, so that's kind of cool. So I did a lot of research around that and did a lot of history, and so it's really cool. I love genealogy. I just love genealogy. So, and I have Granny Maud, I think, had 12 kids, and my mom was one of the older ones, Martha Daisy Bear, and she was one of the older ones. And I have 3 brothers that are younger and 3 sisters that are older. All my sisters and 2 of my brothers live down here on Muscogee. One of my brothers was here, but he's bought a house in Birch Hills. He lives in Birch Hills now. Always been a very close-knit family as well. But I also remember when I was growing up, I was fortunate to live with my Granny Maud and my great-grandpa Henry in the same house. And my great-grandpa Henry lived to 106, and he died actually in the bed in our home. That's when the doctors used to make house calls. And so he came and said, well, he wasn't sick in any way, shape, or form. He was just tired of living, and he couldn't hear, and he could hardly see. So he just decided to quit eating and drinking, and he died peacefully in his bed one day, and that right in our own home. But between him and my Granny Maud, I grew up listening to a lot of history and stories of Muscogee, but from around this area. I do remember my siblings. Okay, I was married in 1975. I was like, it's going to be 50 years next year. I can't believe it. 1975, and I have 3 children. 2 sons and a daughter, and I have 4 grandchildren. I don't have any great-grandchildren yet, but I have 4 grandchildren. They're all Muscogee band members. What else about my family?
Question. Okay, when you said like your mom had married a non-indigenous man and she lost her status, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I've heard it before, but I'm fully not aware, and somebody else had mentioned that in one of these videos.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was when, according to the Indian Act, if a female, only a female married a non-indigenous person, they lost their status. Okay. If a female married a status person from another band, they had to move to that band. But if, and there's many cases on Muscogee, I think of Rosalie and Eric Bear, for example, and Charlie Crane and his wife. If a non-Indigenous woman married an Indigenous man from Muscatine, she not only got to live on the reserve with them, she gained status. So it was really very, very discriminatory piece of action. And there was I think it's called the LaValle case. It was the LaValle case, and she took it to the United Nations, she took it to the Supreme Court, and finally they ruled in the favor that it was very, very discriminatory. So then Bill C-31 came into play. So after Bill C-31 was passed, and how discriminatory that piece of legislation was in the Indian Act, women could regain their status. So my mom did that. She regained her status. I can't remember when. It was in the late 80s, I believe. And so she regained her status. And because I was, and it's all about how the government labels people, and it's all about government rules and regulations, not about kinship at all, right? So when my mom applied and she gained her status back, I was able to apply and get my status back. But before that, I was not status. I was not a status person because I never ever had a treaty number. My sister, and then my kids could apply, but at first they were denied. They had to go through courts again. But my sister, who's my full-blooded sister next to me, she was born just before my mom and dad got married. She was born, so she actually had a status number like my mom did, but she lost it when my mom lost hers. But because she was what they call, she had a number, her kids could automatically get treaty and mine couldn't. Yet we're sisters. That's what I mean about labels and the government bureaucracy, right? It's just like, oh. So, but they managed to fix that as well, and so now my kids were able to get treaty as well. So it's quite, but they never did anything about those women who gained status that shouldn't have had status, and their families who maybe shouldn't have either. But it's all still very murky, I guess you could say, in terms of whose status, who isn't, and who gained and who didn't. And it did give Muscatine many, many more band members because of that. But for a long time after that, still discriminated against, because as Bill C-31, sometime at the beginning, on Muscatine in the beginning and other First Nations, they weren't allowed to have houses, etc. They had to fight. But now that's not a thing, right? Now it's supposed to be fair and equitable now. But that's how Bill C-31 worked, and it's all because of the Indian Act and all the discrimination in the Indian Act. It's crazy.
It is.
It is crazy.
Because I was insulted when I first heard about it, because I've never known. I haven't.
Yep.
And I think that might be the case of my grandma.
Yeah, could be.
But anyways.
But if women weren't the only ones at that time, if they married non-Indigenous people who lost their status. Our men who went to military, went to the wars, doing their duty. They were recruited and doing their duty. Because they also lost their status. They became what they called enfranchised. So they were sort of what you call regular Canadian citizens. And so they lost their rights as well. And anybody, people could give up their rights. And some people did, just for voting purposes, for example. Because we never got to vote till 1959 or something like that. Women never, Aboriginal people never had the vote till the late 1950s. I remember that very clearly. Yeah, I was very young, but I remember it. Yeah, so that's a little bit of that history, but it's a fascinating history, but it's also very discriminatory. Yeah, the Indian Act is a very discriminatory piece of legislation that, for a lot of reasons, never should have been passed. It's because we have residential schools. That's why we had pass system, all those things, right? Yeah.
So with the pass system, did your mom and dad have to do that when they moved back here?
No, it was done by then.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my mom and dad didn't move here till, oh gosh, quite a bit after, in the late 1990s, I believe it was, in the 90s, sometimes before they moved back. The pass system was gone by then, but the pass system, you could not leave Muscadet unless you had a pass from the Indian agent saying you could go into town, get groceries, saying you could go into town, visit, or whatever, right? You couldn't have a pass system for anything. You couldn't even have a pass system. You couldn't even sell a cow. You couldn't sell anything without a pass, without say so from the Indian agent. And if you left the Muscadet without a pass and got caught, you'd be thrown in jail. It was so bad. And the thing that I found out in my history and my research, because I've done a lot of research on this stuff because I find it very interesting, was that the apartheid system in South Africa was modeled after the pass system here in Canada. And then they got the apartheid system in South Africa. Yeah, and that's...
Wow.
Yeah. That's the influence that the Indian Act had on negative, very negative to our people. But in some ways, even to this day, it is a bit of a protection as well, right? In terms of our funding and stuff like that. There has to be something put in place to replace the Indian Act, but we need to get rid of the Indian Act.
Yes. So getting back to the questions.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine.
But you did ask.
I did ask. Yeah, I did. So,
what do I remember as a child?
Yeah, what do you remember as a child in Muscadet?
Okay. I never really grew up here, but I spent a lot of summers here and holidays here. But one of the things that I remember so clearly when we drove here, and I'll always remember this and it always comes to mind, is that when we lived on the farm, we had electricity and we had a well with a little bit of running water, but it was also kind of warm. It was warm because we burnt coal and we had a little oil furnace. And we had a television set. I remember that clearly, having this old television set. And I was quite young. But when we came down to Muscadet, and often if it was in the evening and it was dark, especially in the wintertime, if we came down for supper on Sundays to Granny and Grandpa's place, we always came down on the weekends, always. And usually on a Sunday in the winter. And I would watch, and it was completely dark down here. There was no electricity at that time, none. And I would just keep watching them because I knew where my grandma and grandpa lived, right? And we'd come back the back roads because there was no highway here then. So we'd come down the back roads, and they just lived on the other side of the village now. And finally, we'd get so close before we could see a little glow in the window from the coal oil lamps. We knew they were home. I don't know where else they would have been, but we knew they were home, and I'd say, yay! So we'd jump out and go inside. But then one day, we were coming down, quite a few years later, I don't remember when the power came, but all of a sudden I looked around, there were lights everywhere on Muscadet. Muscadet finally got power. Couldn't believe it. But that was quite in the 60s, like before they first had power down here.
Wow.
It was a long time without power and without running water. Also, I remember visiting Grandma and Grandpa, and they had two horses. Tiny and Nellie, I believe they were called, yeah. And we used to love to ride them. They were working horses. They're bigger horses, but we'd have to get a bridle on them and take them down to water them in the river and stuff like that. And so it was a lot of fun, and Grandpa would always take us in the wintertime on hay rides or the sleigh rides, but also we'd go with him to get water, because we would go up the hill. It was called up the hill, but I can't remember whose land or who was near that area, and there was a natural pump there for a spring, and that's where people would go get their water. So he'd take his barrels up there, and we'd get the water and bring them home. And he had a big barrel inside for drinking water, and I remember that, him going to get that all the time. I always remember the food, because it was always fry bannock, and Granny was always making bannock, and a lot of times fry bannock. In the summertime, in her summer kitchen, she'd always cook outside because it was too hot inside. She'd make fry bannock. She had these bushes right beside her kitchen, camp kitchen, where chokecherries grew. But I always liked to go in there and make a little playhouse, so I get all the stuff out of the way. Well, she caught me in there. She'd grab one of those chokecherry bushes, and I get a whipping with her. Get away from my bushes! You're wrecking my bushes! So I learned to stay away from her bushes. But I could run fast. I didn't get too much of a whipping because she couldn't catch me. And the other thing I remember is when we had colds, and I hated it. That she'd give us this medicine, and it was, I think it was, she'd put a teaspoon of sugar in it anyways, coal oil she'd give us. And that's what she'd give us if we ever went there with a cold. So if I had a cold, I'd try my hardest not to cough because I hated that stuff. I don't think that stuff was good for you, but that's what she gave us. So I remember some home remedies from her as well. But growing up with a lot of stories and a lot of stuff like that. I remember going to see my great-grandpa Henry when he lived alone until he was in his 90s. He lived by himself in a house on the hill, because at the time we just had the flats and the hill. We didn't come across the river because there was no bridge. And so he'd come out of the bush when we went to go visit him. He'd come out of the bush, and he would be carting a whole bunch of red willow. And so he would make his tobacco out of the inner bark of the red willow. He'd scrape it all and dry it. He often mixed it with his club tobacco. He called it club tobacco. But he often would come out of the bush, and he'd collect his own tobacco to make his tobacco last longer. But I think that's one of the reasons he lived he was so long, because he smoked a pipe a lot. But that inner bark of the red willow is good medicine. So that's probably why he lasted as long as he did, because like I said, he was very old when he died. So yeah, so there's some of the things. I remember some of the stories they told me about. This one story about Grandpa Henry when he was little. He wasn't old enough to be a soldier to go to fight in any of the battles at the one at the Batoche, but he remembered hiding on a hill, being on a hill, watching the battle happen. So some of the people from Muscadet must have been watching it. That was before, I believe, that was in 1885. Yeah, that was after Muscadet was already a reserve. So they were watching it from a distance. And I remember Granny telling me stories about when she'd go down to the riverbank, and they would go down to play or swim. And one time this canoe came around the corner, she says, full of Indians. I just laughed at her. But she meant the Indians you see on television, Yeah. They had the kind of a mohawk cut. And apparently they were very afraid of those types of Indians.
Oh.
So that she ran up the bank. But South Saskatchewan was a natural canoe route. It was their highway. So there was lots of traffic up and down that river. But they were afraid of certain kinds of people who came down. And some of them, I heard, and could have been a rumor, but it's just what I heard, that they used to kidnap kids. So and take them back to their villages. So yeah, so a lot of stories like that I remember very clearly.
Wow.
Lots of stories. It's coming back more to me as I talk about them too,
Yeah.
And yeah, and my granny. And my granny lived with us for quite a while till she got dementia really bad and Alzheimer's, so she had to go to a home for the last few years. Didn't remember anybody anymore. But yeah, it was, and no other way of growing up than growing up with your grandparents, your extended family. That's what we did, and that's what happened down here. Everybody's grandparents lived with them. not everybody, I guess, but most of the people I know, you're always welcome in any home. Like all my aunts and uncles, and I have lots of aunts and uncles down here, had lots, and I've got tons of relatives down here. And they're always welcome in any of their homes. It was awesome, awesome. When my mom finally moved back down and she got a house down here, she was a very active member of the elders. And but the main thing she did was she liked to go to church and sing. She loved to sing. We always went to church anyway. Well, when we were kids, we were forced to go to church anyway and sing, and I loved singing. But my dad never went, and my grandpa Leonard never went, because we'd go on Sunday morning, come down here, and sometimes Mom wouldn't go because there was always a card game going on at their house. So everybody, two of my uncles, Uncle Harvey, I believe it was, and Uncle Austin, still lived at home because they were the youngest ones. And so there would always be a card game happening, and Mom would want to stay and play cards because our family are big card players, right? Big game players, but cards especially. So she'd sometime, Granny Maud, never played cards in her life, never set foot in a bar in her life, never drank in her life, never smoked. She was very Christian, always went to church. She wasn't happy if we didn't go to church, so we had to go. Sometimes Mom went, but Mom loved to sing too. So that's when she moved down here, she would go every week to the Anglican church. Yeah, where they're both buried. Yeah,
that's nice.
Yeah, so it's cool. Lots of things like that, and I remember dances too. That's the other thing I was talking about to other people the other day. I think it was at that conference we were at. The dances we had, because we had the Greenland dancers there. And of course, remember when we had all those dances at Muscadet? Somebody's always housed a dance. Somebody's house we'd go to, and there would be dancing and dancing. I said, I remember those dances. And I remember those dances when we were at the old school that's still here, that one-room schoolhouse. I remember we went to dances there, and I would get tired, and all the kids, whoever was there, kids were always welcome. We'd hide underneath the benches or in that one little closet room over there, and we'd sleep, and they'd dance, and when they were ready to go home, they would wake us up and away we'd go, but we always were at those dances. I loved those dances. You don't see that anymore. People don't get together like that anymore. I'm not saying there weren't problems. There were, as far as I knew, there were never any drugs down here. I don't know when they started. But there was alcohol. There was always been alcohol, but not in the way it is today. But there was always alcohol at the dances, and some people drink, and some people didn't, and some people got into fights, and the next day they would be just all buddy-buddy. And I never could figure that part out. But it wasn't obsessive like it is now, and sometimes they just drink to have a good time, but no, that was my Granny Maud. Used to play at home with her, play parcheesies especially. She liked playing parcheesies and Chinese checkers, and with the marbles, and she played until she couldn't remember how to anymore. And we still play those games today too. My mom's the same way. Doesn't matter where she was, I'd always come down and I'll go to the hospital or wherever and play games with her. So we really like to, and we still do like to play games, like play cards. But it was a lot of fun. People laughed and had fun. My Granny Maud, ooh, she's competitive. She was so competitive.
That's where Cecilia gets it from.
Yeah, Cecilia, very competitive. Dorothy. Both of them, yeah. So, yeah. The other thing I remember, and this is because I grew up after East Central School. I moved into down here for a while. We were living here for one whole winter in Auntie Shirley and Uncle Donald's home. because they just gotten a new house. So there was no running water and no fire. It was cold in that winter. There would be ice in the bucket in the kitchen where the water bucket was. It would be full of ice. And I remember Dad running because we put coals in the wood cook stove overnight. There might be some a little bit left. He'd run and grab some with his gloves and throw them in to start a fire in the pot-bellied stove in the bedroom where we all slept. There was only the bedroom, living room, and a kitchen. And it was so cold. But we lived down here for a year. And I went, I don't even remember what school I went to. I think I still went to East Central because I think that there was also at one time East Central kids, Muscadet kids did go to East Central School for a while. After then, they just went to different schools before the school down here was built. They also went, after that, they went to Birch Hill School for quite a while. Then they got the school down here. Yeah, so I remember that being down here, that cold, cold winter. And then we moved into Prince Albert, and my dad got a job in town, and we lived in PA, and my great-grandpa came with us. And I went to Riverside High School, and all my friends from here and from when I went to East Central went to, I forget the name of the school, at Composite High School, I believe it was called back then, for rural kids and stuff. So I wanted to go there, but I couldn't. So I went to Riverside, graduated from there. But there was a lot of kids from All Saints, they called it, up at the residential school, All Saints Residential School, attended Riverside. They attended a few of the schools, but a lot of them attended Riverside. So made a lot of friends there, but yeah, so that was interesting. But it was leading me somewhere, and I forget. Oh, oh gosh, where did the thought go? I stayed a lot out at Davis, where I live now. We built our house in 1980. But before that, I used to hang out with the Mackay kids down there and the Brass kids. Brass kids are from Muscadet. Actually, the Mackay kids are too. Mackays are from Muscadet too. Back then, both Brasses were from Uncle Ronald's reserve, but Agnes and Wilford were same Bill C-31, so they didn't have status till later. But I hung out with them because we were the same age, and I remember walking by from Mackay's house down to Brass's house. It wasn't very far, a quarter of a kilometer, but we always go by Dannett's store. And that's where a lot of people from Muscadet would stop and shop, Dannett's store. And it was a general store, so they had food, they had boots, they had clothing, they had traps, they had everything there, right? And so I remember people stopping in and shopping at Dannett's store. But I also remember my Grandpa Leonard walking sometimes, or taking a horse and buggy or a sleigh and going to Dannett's store to get supplies for, or PA sometimes for, the month or whatever he'd shop there. But yeah, it was kind of halfway between Muscadet and PA, Davis is. It used to be quite a thriving little community there at one time. So that store, was there for quite a while until it burnt down, and I can't remember. It burnt down before we moved out there. We've been in the 70s, it burnt.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's neat to know.
Down at Sisters, yeah. A couple of sisters owned the store. How do I remember from medicine people? I did not know any medicine people back then in the community. I didn't know of very many people who actually practiced their culture back then. They didn't. The Anglican Church had a big influence on people in this community. My mom was a very strong Christian. My Auntie Cicely was a very strong Christian. And they both didn't believe in sweats or anything like that, right? Smudging, that was to them, and that's what they were taught. That was the devil's work. That's what they were taught. But after I went to high school, I went to Kelsey, and then I went to Suntep, and I learned so much. And I went to sweats. I learned all about sweats, and I went to sweats. I've never ever told my mom that I did that. I was still afraid of her. Never told Auntie Cicely about sweats either. But you know, she was a little more open towards the end because she lived a lot longer than my mom did.
Yeah.
My mom died when she was 69. Yeah. And Auntie Cicely was in her 90s when she passed away. So. But yeah, I don't remember much about that. But I do remember Mom and others talking about it, and the Knight family started sweats and started doing more cultural stuff, and they didn't like it at all. They didn't like that. They thought that was not good, and right? So, but you know, it's the church did a lot of damage in terms of the church did a lot of good, but the church did a lot of damage in terms of our culture. A lot of damage. But I mean, it has done good in saving people too, and sometimes. And if you know, a lot of people who drank too much turned to Christianity, and that's a good thing, you know. But the Anglican Church wasn't quite as bad as a Catholic Church. The Anglican Church, we had the day school down here. My mom went to the day school. She was not allowed to speak her language or practice their culture. And it was run by the Anglican Church. She never spoke a word of Cree to us, ever. She understood it perfectly. When we went to Granny and Grandpa's, they would speak Cree all the time. And they'd speak Cree to her, but she'd always answer in English. Because they could understand English too. But because she didn't live, like my dad spoke Danish, and he spoke Danish to us, and I picked up the odd thing, but still remember. I remember Chief Eric. Eric was chief for a while, I believe. Or Eric's dad. Eric Bear's dad was chief, I believe. I remember Everett Bear being chief, and Austin Bear's been chief a long time. So, it goes back quite a ways, but I don't remember who the first chiefs were when I was young. But I remember that Chief Mervyn was a chief for a while too. And Ava, of course, now we have Ron. So I remember a few of the chiefs. Counselors, I don't remember as much. I always remember the chief because I thought the chief was a cool thing, right? We have a chief and this is our chief. I don't remember much about the counselors, though. I don't remember much about them until I started voting down here when I got my status back. So that would have been in the 1990s before I did start voting down here. We actually didn't get the vote till Aboriginal people or Indigenous people didn't get the vote till here until 1959, I believe it was, or 60, something like that. So, and still, it took a long time before people know we have a chief and council, we have our own political body. And so even though we could vote in a provincial election or a federal election, most people didn't, you know. Still some don't, the older ones don't to this day. But now it's getting to be more understood that yes, we have a say in what goes on in Canada and Saskatchewan, as well as what goes on in our First Nations. I don't much remember about the leadership way back when either. I just remember, like I said, that we had a chief and councillors that ran everything, but I just didn't know how they did that. I wasn't really into politics till I got older after I got married. So. The history of Muscadet. I find I've done some research actually on the history of Muscadet, and I used to work with a fellow when I was working at Suntep. His name was John Thornton, and he was a history buff. And we got to talking one day, and he was looking at the history of the people who were around Prince Albert, the Métis and First Nations people around Prince Albert before Prince Albert became a city. And there were a lot of Métis people and First Nations people who lived in Prince Albert at that time. And under James Isbister was kind of the leader, I guess, at that time in that area. And he said, and after the rebellion of after the signing of the treaty in 1867, 76 that the treaty was signed, they kind of disappeared. And I said, oh, really? So I did some research, and I discovered that a lot of those people actually lived around this area too, and moved here to sign the treaty. So the Muscadet is actually made up of a lot of Métis people who signed the treaty. They had to give up their any script or anything like that, but a lot of them didn't have that. They were cheated out of it when they moved here anyway. That's why they moved, and they were being cheated out of it again. And so they actually signed treaty with the First Nations people at that time. So we have a mixture on Muscadet when they were signing the treaty, and I've got the signatures. I've seen the signatures of the people who signed, and there are some definitely First Nations names, but definitely some Métis names as well. So, and the people down here are a lot lighter colored, and I think that's part of the Métis part. As far as my own ancestry goes, I know my Métis part of me is from Red River with Annabella Kennedy, but there's also some Métis on my other side as well. So yeah, there was a lot of, and I remember my Grandpa Henry's mom, I believe, was they kept talking about my Auntie Cicely especially, a little French lady, and her name was Aimon, and so she was a little French lady. So I know there's a lot of mixed blood down here, and so the signing of the treaty, Muscadet is like Métis First Nations as well, not just. So it's an interesting combination. And I'm sure a lot of people down here, especially the Bears, because I've traced it back for everybody. Traced it back right to Magnus Tate. And so it's a lot of, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Annabella Kennedy's dad is George Kennedy, came right from England. So I got English on the one side, the Scots on the other side, and who knows what in between. I know that a lot of these people, sometimes in that genealogy, they would write down like Philip Kennedy or Philip Bear married, I can't remember what her name was, but one Philip Bear married Indian woman. That's all it said. So how do you trace something like that back, right?
Yeah.
But there was a lot of that because they didn't know their names. So they just put married Indian woman.
Wow.
Yeah.
Could be
Well,
anybody.
sometimes they say married Indian woman from so-and-so, where they put the name but didn't know where they were from. So it kind of dies in a lot of ways, the lineage, but yeah, you still can trace back a long ways. So I know a fair amount about the history of Muscadet in terms of how it was settled and when it was settled and who it was settled. The first, John Smith was the one who signed the treaty. And that's all from my research and my classes I took when I went back to school in, it was in the 90s, I believe, yeah.
Have you ever thought about writing a book?
I have lots of times. I don't have the time. But what I need to get is one of those things where I can just talk and they'll record, that computer or whatever, but yeah. But no, there's a lot of stories, a lot of history that I have up in my head.
Yeah, because essentially this is the direction I want to go with these videos is to be able to speak for your parents who are obviously gone, but to also your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and your nieces and nephews and great-nieces and nephews will be seeing this video, down the road, and then further you go, like, you know, you may not be here one day and we'll still have this information for
Right.
everybody to share. So
Yeah.
it kind of keeps your connection too. Like, you know,
Right.
that's what I've explained to the other people who are doing these videos on behalf of whomever, like,
Yeah.
you know, and adding your information there too, because
Yeah.
it's important.
It's
Yeah.
very important. History is very important. They say you should learn your mistakes from history, and often we don't. But there's so much you can learn from history. You can, and because our culture was, we had to hide it because the Indian Act, we weren't allowed to practice it. It went underground for a long time. But Indigenous people around the world, I find, because I've been very fortunate to travel around the world and to a lot of Indigenous communities, very resilient, very resilient. It's just is how we have survived the Indian Act and all of the residential school and the 60s scoop and the pass system and the banning of our culture. That's how we have survived. We're resilient. So that's so important. And I think the other thing that really, it was a saving grace for us is the humor. Because through it all, sometimes the laughter is healing, but the laughter helps you cope. Because with all the stuff that went on with my mom and her parents, you know, with the residential school, we were very fortunate. My mom never went to residential school. It's because they had the day school down here. And the Anglican Church here was here very early on and set up the day school. So we never went to residential school because the day school was here. But it still did a lot of damage. But it's the humor. Like, how would you survive? Well, you had the dances and the get-togethers and the laughter. And you had to hide things. So, but it's all coming back. And yes, we've lost some stuff. But sometimes it's in there, right? People will remember it, and you have to just coax it out sometimes. And it's in there. Medicine bundles were hidden, and that's a good thing because they weren't destroyed. So once we were allowed to practice our culture again, they were dug up. The stories were never lost, never. And I think that's what saved us as well, is the stories. The personal stories, the historical stories, the legends, all of those stories saved us. Saved our culture, kept it alive. So if I were to say anything to the future generations, I think is to remember those stories. Keep those stories. Stories are so important. But a lot of our stories have been written down, and that's okay, but we need to get our oral storytelling back. We need to tell those stories. People ask me, I go do a lot of storytelling in the schools. People ask me, is it okay if I share that story? I said, absolutely, but I ask you two things. First, you acknowledge where it comes from, and I don't mean acknowledge me. I acknowledge where that story comes from. Is it a Cree story? Is it a Ojibwe story? Is it my grandfather's story? You acknowledge where that story comes from. The second thing is you tell that story. Don't read it out of a book. Tell that story. It's powerful. Storytelling is very powerful. And so that's how we need to remember it, and how we have passed on our history for thousands and thousands of years. Thousands of years. Good? Enough?
Well, thank you so much for sharing your history and your knowledge with us, Benta.
Oh,
We appreciate you having you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I talked lots.